At 1 o'clock, the BBC News, now on BBC One Wales with Shaun Ley and Liz Clements.
Boris Johnson will meet with his scientific advisers this afternoon as he considers whether to introduce further coronavirus restrictions in England. In Scotland and Northern Ireland, further measures come into force today for pubs, bars and cafes to try to slow the spread of the Omicron variant. Talks between the government and UK energy providers after warnings that bills could jump by 50% in 2022. National Trust warns some landscapes in the UK could be altered forever by extreme weather conditions. And England's hopes of an Ashes comeback are fading rapidly in a dramatic second day of the third test in Melbourne. Hello, good afternoon. Welcome to the 1 o'clock news. Boris Johnson will meet his scientific advisers later today as he considers whether to introduce further coronavirus restrictions in England to slow the spread of the Omicron variant. It's expected he'll hear about the impact on hospital admissions and on NHS staff sickness in recent days. Further controls will come into effect today in Northern Ireland and Scotland. The new measures affect the hospitality and leisure industries. In Scotland, nightclubs have to close for at least 3 weeks, and 1 metre social distancing and table service has been reinstated in hospitality settings where alcohol is served. Table service has also resumed in hospitality venues across Northern Ireland. There, no more than 6 people will be allowed to sit together. Dancing is also prohibited except at weddings. Yesterday in Wales, the First Minister announced that the rule of 6 was reinstated for people meeting in pubs, cinemas and restaurants. Our correspondent Simon Jones has been looking at the picture around the UK.
After the Christmas festivities, now it's decision time for the Prime Minister. Boris Johnson will be poring over the latest COVID data to see if he thinks new measures are needed in England. At this bar in Bristol, they say they need clarity as they look ahead to the new year.
He needs to get on with it. He needs to get on with it now, and he needs to tell people now. People need to know now. They've got staff that they need to put in place. They've got security that they need to book. They've got stock that they need to order. He needs to tell people now, right now, so they know what they're doing.
A key consideration is going to be hospital admissions and whether Omicron infections could lead to the NHS being overwhelmed. Downing Street said before Christmas that it would not hesitate to act if necessary. But Boris Johnson will face a battle to convince some of his MPs that changes are needed.
My view is that the government is going to sit tight and want more, wait for more information and wait for a signal that Omicron, if it indeed it is more severe in older people, whereas the devolved governments have decided to act sooner.
Yesterday in Wales, social distancing measures were reintroduced. From today in Northern Ireland, there are new restrictions for pubs and restaurants. It'll be table service only, and a maximum of 6 people will be allowed to sit together.
We try to be sensible and both protect ourselves and each other.
I am slightly bewildered. I don't understand them. I've come over from Scotland, so everything's different.
Table service too has come in Scotland, where alcohol is served. Nightclubs will have to close for a period of at least 3 weeks. The Scottish Health Secretary this morning visited a vaccination centre in Perth.
This is still going to be very difficult for businesses. But of course, if we let this virus run out of control or get ahead of us, that would be even worse for the economy.
As people wait to hear what further new restrictions might be needed for the new year, the government has insisted that no decisions have yet been taken for England. And today's briefing by scientists is one of a series of regular updates given to the Prime Minister. Boris Johnson has not yet called a cabinet meeting or announced a recall of Parliament. Simon Jones, BBC News.
Well, in a moment we'll be talking to our correspondents in Scotland and in Northern Ireland about the latest restrictions there. First, though, to our political correspondent, Arnie Wells, who's with me in the studio. Arnie, does the fact that the Prime Minister has not recalled the Cabinet for a meeting, still less recalled Parliament, give some encouraging signs about the picture, for now at least?
I think that's right to say for now this is a sign of no movement just yet on any restrictions in England, because he has made that promise to MPs that they would get a say on any more legal restrictions in England. He could, however, issue some more stronger guidance if he thought that was necessary, although even that is something that has been met so far with quite fierce resistance from a number of Conservative MPs as well. Now, I think there is a sort of acknowledgement that any further legal restrictions in England would be politically quite difficult. First, there's the issue of getting it through his own MPs. Remember last time when he introduced COVID passports in England, he relied on Labour votes to get that through with a massive Tory rebellion. Then there's also the issue of getting it through his fellow government ministers. At the moment, a lot of government ministers not very keen on the idea of further restrictions. So at the moment, Boris Johnson's able to sort of use his cabinet as a bit of a sort of shield, really, with all of them, well, the majority of them at least, wanting to see more data on hospitalisations before making any decisions. They say unless kind of rising hospitalisations could justify further restrictions, they don't currently want to introduce any. However, I think these next few days are really going to be key. Firstly, as we've heard there, businesses are looking for certainty, particularly ahead of New Year's Eve, about whether or not there will be any further restrictions. But also government's now towing this very difficult line to navigate between not wanting to act until hospitalisations rise steeply, but also not wanting to leave things too late if the data does start to point that way.
Annie Wells, thanks very much. Well, as we heard, in Scotland, temporary measures have begun for hospitality and leisure businesses. Let's talk now to our correspondent, Katrina Renton in Glasgow. Katrina, these are significant measures, but they're ones that in many ways people in Scotland will be familiar with.
Well, that's right. And yesterday restrictions were introduced to deal with large crowds. Today the focus is on hospitality and indoor areas. So pubs, restaurants, cinemas, theatres and gyms. And as you say, a lot of them have already been exercising these measures already. Now they'll have to ensure that there's a 1 metre distance between groups of people, and those groups of people cannot contain more than 3 households. Where alcohol is being served, table service will have to be used. So of course that will be the impact on pubs, where people can no longer stand at the bar. Now nightclubs as well, of course, will be affected, and they can only really open if they offer table service and if they can do the distancing measures as well. The Scottish Government has made extra money available to mitigate some of this, but of course the hospitality industry views some of these restrictions as yet another blow. Now outside events, no more than 500 people can meet outside, so of course that is going to have a massive impact on public events at Hogmanay. Effectively, those are cancelled. Restrictions are reviewed here every 3 weeks, so the next date for the diary to look at is the 11th of January.
Katrina Renton in Glasgow, thank you very much. Well, Louise Cullen is in Dungannon in Northern Ireland for us now. Louise, no dancing except at weddings.
Yes, that's the only exception for that. But really this fresh mix of regulations and recommendations, it's a bit of a return to the familiar for Northern Ireland around table service and hospitality settings, working from home where possible and limiting the number of households allowed to gather in a private home. The law around face coverings is also being strengthened, with some exemptions being removed. There's a grace period before that'll be reinforced until January the 7th. The executive here meets in 72 hours' time to look at all these restrictions and crucially to decide if more are needed. Now, the Finance Minister has said there will be further support available for businesses affected, but for many hospitality businesses, they've already cancelled New Year's Eve here rather than take the risk of buying in stock and booking staff. Health officials did warn last week that we could need significant interventions after Christmas as the spread of Omicron continues. But they said that does depend on what the data says and, importantly, on the decisions we all make between now and then.
Yeah, it's down to us in many ways, isn't it, Louise? Louise Cullen in Dungannon, thank you very much. Now, there have been more COVID-related flight cancellations, with more than 1,400 flights cancelled around the world on Monday. Destinations in the United States and China have been the worst hit. US airlines say the disruption is due to crews testing positive or isolating. In all, since Christmas Eve, more than 8,000 flights have been grounded. New York City has made it compulsory for everyone aged 12 and above to be fully vaccinated against COVID in order to access indoor entertainment and sport activities. It's also become the first US city to require vaccine for all private sector workers. Jabs are already mandatory for state employees. Now, the Business Secretary Kwasi Kwarteng has held talks with leading energy firms amid calls for the government to do more to tackle the crisis caused by a surge in wholesale gas prices. Millions of households in the UK are expected to face a dramatic rise in energy bills next year. The government has said it wants to make sure consumers are protected. Our business correspondent Vishala Sripathma reports.
It's been a constant worry for households for the past 3 months. Rising prices of gas and electricity around the world have meant we've all been paying more to heat our homes and cook our meals. 26 energy companies have gone bust since September, and more casualties are expected in the industry as there's no sign of prices falling.
Our number one ask going into the meeting is that the government and the regulator are taking the situation very seriously. They're prepared to start taking action, not in the months to come, but in the days to come. Because I think if we don't find a solution in the coming weeks, we're certainly going to be locking UK consumers into more and more expensive energy for years to come.
Labour is calling on the government to use money raised through higher than expected VAT receipts to cut household bills. The party says higher energy and food prices have meant more VAT being paid, so the extra money should be used to help people struggling with a higher cost of living. The government said they are regularly engaging with the industry and are continuing to support those most in need. The energy price cap is expected to be on the agenda as well. It stops companies from passing rising costs on to their customers. The cap will be reviewed again in April, when bills could go up as much as 50%. Not the good news families were hoping for this festive period, with many already struggling to keep the lights on. Vishala Sripathma, BBC News.
Now, West Mercia Police have sent a written apology to the relatives of the former Premier League footballer Dalian Atkinson, 6 months after an officer who tasered him and kicked him in the head was jailed for his manslaughter. West Mercia's Chief Constable Pippa Mills said she was deeply sorry, adding that a police uniform should not grant officers immunity to behave unlawfully. Wildlife across the UK is increasingly suffering the impacts of extreme weather events and natural disasters. That's the verdict of the National Trust as it publishes its annual reckoning of UK wildlife's winners and losers. The conservation charity also warns that some of the landscapes it cares for are being altered for good. Our climate editor Justin Rowlatt reports.
This is one of this year's wildlife winners. The first beaver family was released onto National Trust property in Somerset in 2020, and this year it produced its first kit. The baby beaver was born in June. But the UK's changing weather patterns brought losers too. Some seabird populations were hit by the storms that swept the country. Other birds suffered from the unseasonable cold spells and frequent heavy rain in the summer.
I've come to Newark Park Estate in Gloucestershire to find out more about how our changing climate is affecting the National Trust's landscapes and the wildlife it cares for. And just look at this wonderful place, a Tudor hunting lodge with, look over here, the most incredible views right out across to the Mendip Hills.
We've had to remove all of our ash trees, unfortunately, because they've succumbed to ash dieback.
The fungal disease, which affects adult trees, is now common across Britain.
So we're finding that the moist conditions that we get as well, wet and warm, are really great for these things to spread in our current climate.
The National Trust lost thousands more trees in storms. Storm Arwen, which ripped through the north of the country in late November, was particularly destructive. And some properties, like this stretch of the Dorset coast, were changed forever. This landslip, caused in part by extreme dry and wet spells, took a great bite out of the cliffs at Thornton Beacon.
The kind of regular rhythms of the seasons are kind of drifting away, and we're now getting this new normal, which is pretty unpredictable and has some really big extreme kind of weather events. And all of that has kind of massive impact on our wildlife.
This year's wildlife losers include spring blossoming trees in the south of England, which suffered a series of late frosts. But some seal populations flourished, with record numbers of seals recorded on some Suffolk beaches. The warm and settled autumn produced spectacular shows of colour across the country and helped some grassland fungi to thrive. The Trust warns extreme weather is increasingly becoming the new normal, but says it is possible to strengthen ecosystems against climate change. Justin Rowlatt, BBC News, Newark Park Estate in Gloucestershire.
Now, South Africa has begun a week of events to commemorate the anti-apartheid leader Archbishop Desmond Tutu. Bells rang at midday today from St George's Anglican Cathedral in Cape Town, and they'll ring every noon for the next 5 days to mark Tutu's life. Table Mountain and City Hall in Cape Town will also be lit up in purple, the colour of his clerical robes, of course, every night until the late Archbishop's funeral this coming Saturday. Family breakdown is one of the leading causes of homelessness in the UK, but not enough is being done to help loved ones stay together. Homelessness charities have told the BBC. Our reporter Adam Ely has been to meet Rhys Mackay, who slept rough in Newcastle for almost 5 years without seeing loved ones, but whose life has since been transformed.
I missed them lots, especially times like birthdays and Christmases.
When Rhys left home aged 18 after disagreements with his mum, he lost contact with his family altogether. For almost 5 years he slept rough on the streets of Newcastle.
The longer I got, the harder it become to kind of reach out and speak to them. Thought about them all the time, but I had deteriorated quite a lot. You know, I looked very unwell, didn't want them to see us in the way I was.
Family breakdown is one of the leading causes of homelessness. West Midlands-based charity St Basil's says more must be done to help families stay together where appropriate.
Ultimately, if we're just putting a roof over people's head and we're not dealing with the issues that led to them being homeless, all that's going to happen is those people are going to end up in that same situation again.
The charity has staff trained in mediation and provides parenting workshops. It wants such support to be rolled out more widely.
We would be looking at local authorities to really adopt this.
The Local Government Association called on ministers to provide more long-term investment, while the government said it was spending £2 billion over the next 3 years to tackle rough sleeping in England. Back in Newcastle, Rhys struggled with his mental health while living on the streets.
Being kicked, punched, you know, spat on, felt like society had given up on us, so I gave up on myself. Made us quite suicidal, and I did try and take my own life on more than one occasion.
Then, after almost 5 years on the streets, Rhys's life was turned on its head. He was in court being sentenced for shoplifting offences when his mum walked through the doors, having found out his whereabouts.
I was just total state of shock. I thought I was dreaming for a moment. I just looked at her and she burst into tears. I tell her, look, I'm going to be okay. I'm going to prison. But when I get out, I'm going to make some changes and I'm going to start speaking to my family again. And I've been in contact with them ever since.
The charity Crisis says where it's right to reconnect family, it can offer individuals a sense of belonging.
So we do see, you know, parents and children reconnected. Everyone needs support and a network around them. And so when we can make that happen, it can be so powerful.
Rhys says reconnecting with his family is giving him the basis to build his life again.
Just having my family back on my side really makes a difference on how I perceive myself and how I view life. I have a little boy at home, lovely partner, nice home, good relationship with my family. Everything I wanted 5 years ago.
Adam Ely, BBC News.
And if you were affected by the issues contained in Adam's report and would like details of organisations which offer advice and support, go online. You'll find bbc.co.uk/action line, all one word, or you can call for free at any time to hear recorded information on the telephone. The number is 0800 066 066, 0800 066 066. England's cricketers are sliding towards a series defeat in the Ashes. Australia are already 2-0 up in the 5-match series and could retain the Ashes as soon as tomorrow. Our sports correspondent Joe Wilson explains.
England's players were unsure for a while if they'd even be allowed in the ground. 4 COVID cases amongst the support staff and their family. But after the test, it continued. And yes, England prospered. Marnus Labuschagne batting, ranked world #1, out for 1. Success for Mark Wood. And what about Steve Smith? Well, here comes James Anderson.
Oh, he's got him, bowled him. And it's...
England quickly dismissed Australia's most esteemed batters. Hey, we're in this. Maybe. Marcus Harris persevered for Australia, not always pretty, but past 50, and that feeling of optimism, it was sneaking away from England. As so often, they needed Anderson. Captain's grateful hands and Harris was gone. But a late flourish helped Australia build their lead. When their innings finally ended, they were 82 runs ahead. And in the last hour, the true context of the day's play. England batting again, Zach Crawley out for 5. The very next ball, David Milan, LBW. Hasib Hamid couldn't last, faint edge, he was gone. So Jack Leach was sent in to defend and defy. 31 for 4, and Australia will be back for more. Joe Wilson, BBC News.
There's news throughout the afternoon on the BBC News channel. The next news on BBC One is at 5:30. But now on BBC One, it's time for the news where you are. Have a good afternoon.
Good afternoon, Prynhawn da. After some coronavirus restrictions came into force yesterday in Wales, one pub owner in Conwy says footfall is down massively. Among the changes, no more than 6 people can now meet in pubs and restaurants. The Welsh Government says they want the rules to be in place for the shortest possible time. Here's Matthew Richards.
Well, I've come to the Irish bar in Llandudno to get a sense of what the last 24 hours have been like. And with me is Phil Ash, who represents West Conwy Pub Watch. Around 120 pubs are a member of that group. Phil, how has it gone so far?
Yesterday wasn't a great day, if I'm honest, for our members. Footfall down massively. Trade has dropped all month, but yesterday people were turning up and they didn't know that there was new rules in place, which made it 10 times harder for us to police.
Well, first of all, can you explain what those new rules are that you're having to follow?
Well, the 2-metre social distancing came back in, track and traces came back in, and mandatory face masks, which a lot of customers will all say they're exempt from.
So it's been quite difficult to enforce those rules?
Yeah, especially when people have had alcohol, then they're not as willing to abide by them.
It must be difficult for business-wise, but I presume you know why these measures are being put in place?
I do get it to a point. It's just that we've had the hardest restrictions out of the 4 nations. Once again, us in Wales have had to have more restrictions put up on us than the other 3 nations, which is a bit unfair, to be fair.
The Welsh Government have announced some money to help businesses. Will that be able to tide you over?
It'll help when we get it. We won't get it, though, if you have a look at the dates, we won't actually get the money until the end of January, which doesn't help for the loss of trade in December. And also, we don't know what it's going to be like between now and when we get that money in the end of January.
And you run a couple of pubs yourself. What decision have you made over the last week or so?
We took the decision leading up to Christmas Eve to close and revert back to takeaway because it's more, we know what roughly we're going to do on that. It's not as up and down as being open because footfall is so down. We just took the decision we have to close.
The coronavirus vaccination programme in Wales has resumed following a 2-day break on Christmas and Boxing Day. The target is that every eligible adult will be offered a booster jab by the end of the month. More tributes have been shared following the death of radio presenter Janice Long. She was best known as a presenter on BBC Radio 1, Radio 2 and Top of the Pops and died aged 66 after